Okay. So, good evening, everyone. I am Shruti Chatterjee, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS review in association with Center of South Asian Studies, University of Hawaii. Under this theme, TMYS Review March 2023 will explore the role of community appearance and individual presentation in shaping cultural identity and ideology. I'd also like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems. And for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit our website www.tellmeyourstory.com. So today's topic of discussion is unisex clothes and emerging trends in self-grooming, popularity of gender-neutral beauty products, clothes, styling, and service providers. We are honored to have with us Professor Lisa McLaughlin and Professor Benilde Reis as our esteemed speakers for this panel. Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am. And I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for tonight is Professor Lisa McLaughlin. Professor Lisa McLaughlin teaches at Miami University, Ohio, USA, in the Department of Media, Journalism, Film, and the program Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her research on gender and media has been published in a number of journals and edited books. She was the editor of the journal Feminist Media Studies for 16 years. Her research emphasizes feminism and the political economy of culture, gender, and communication technologies for development, and feminist approaches to public sphere theory and media policy and governance. Next, we have Professor Benilde Reis. She has always had an immense fascination for fashion from an early age. She started to learn how to sew and design clothes until she began her bachelor's degree. She finished her PhD in fashion design. She worked in the fashion industry and was a researcher in several projects in the textile and clothing industry. She wrote PhD theses, Gendered Issues in Genderless Clothing, Trend versus Paradigm, among other scientific articles, chapters, opinion article. Currently, she is a lecturer at Louisiana University, coordinating curricular units in fashion design and collaborating with other courses in design area. Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am. So now, without further delay, we shall start with our today's session. And first, I would like to request Professor Lisa McLaughlin to present her views on today's topic. And over to you, ma'am.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Judy. After I accepted the TMYS invitation to analyze sex clothing and styling, I was very surprised that there were so many articles, including those from mainstream media, that seek to evaluate cultural trend, which seems to have intensified in the past 5 years. I noticed, for example, that on the positive side, that there's a media site called Feminism in India that has ran especially optimistic stories with statements like genderless fashion is not a mere trend. Here's a political statement that deconstructs patriarchal, heteronormative, limited expression, limited gender expression, I'm sorry. But some articles were more critical of the unisex trend, noting, for example, that the efforts of brands to offer extended sizes and fashion houses like Calvin Klein and Gucci to incorporate men's and women's collections on the runway fell well short of overcoming gender binaries. The queer gender fluid ethos of several brands offering unisex clothing is important, even if they are not capable of overcoming the most entrenched of gender ideologies. Yet the problem of intractable gender binaries persists. For example, a store called Equal in India, EQUL, offers t-shirts, hoodies, shorts, and joggers in extended fluid gender sizes. And Equal identifies itself as an online community store. Um, in and in this place where this is a quote, where your sex, gender, and sexualities, bodies and choices, um, identities, thoughts, arts and style, joys and sorrows, success and failures, problems and solutions, your existence, your stories, your ideas are celebrated for everyone is equal. Yet the images that accompany product descriptions um, picture large men and small women all wearing identical sizes and identical colors and patterns. And I wanted to suggest today that the problem of overcoming gender binaries is not the problem in the first place. Um, that rather than following some scholarship on subcultures and styles, um, as well as this political economy of media, we should look at the problem of the commodity form itself. I would look to kind of illustrate what subcultures and styles has to say about the phenomenon of the capture of commodity forms and how it dilutes and any kind of resistance that might be found in those forms, for example, in this case, unisex clothing. But just to give a definition of feminist political economy in the first place is that feminist political economy enables us to understand gender in relation to social, political, and economic structures of power and gendered access to resources, both symbolic and material resources, within relations of power. What I'm going to say is that, to show it through an example, through an own story, it's the forms of resistance flowing from subcultures, including subcultural styles, that's commodified, feed into high fashion and mainstream fashion, and are therefore tamed. And I think it's the story, my story, since this is Tell Me Your Story. It begins with a story that has elements including unisex punk culture, fashion designer Vivienne Westwood, restore sex, and the general culture of sex and gender fluid, inclusive gender clothing and other styling. And I found the example of the T-shirt because it really operates as a kind of little black dress of unisex dressing, and in the sense that is what anchors the wardrobe and is suitable, it seems, for every unisex occasion. And I started to place a T-shirt in punk rock because although I do not have expertise in fashion studies, as does Hilda, these two things are familiar with me, T-shirts and punk rock. Back when I was young. Okay, I don't have the time to discuss or the knowledge to discuss the entire history of the T-shirt, but if you type in the history of the T-shirt, you can type this into Google, you'll find that many really interesting history of this item. And so, just basically, while the modern T-shirt had begun as an undergarment for the military in the U.S. and Great Britain in the 19th century, for my purposes, by the mid 20th century, the T-shirt had become an outerwear garment, coded masculine, and even sexy, and associated with the likes of Marlon Brando and James Dean. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the T-shirt became unisex, generally inexpensive to produce and purchase, and a blank slate for messages, including political messages, what with, for example, smoke screening beginning in the 1960s. So hippies also had their anti-war messages and often wore tie-dye shirts. But until recently, the tie-dye shirts often worn did not seem to have permeated high fashion or found their way onto retailers' shelves as much as have T-shirts worn by punks. So a little bit about punk style, I guess, on the T-shirt. Punk style was based in a DIY, do-it-yourself politics, as against anything, and thought to be nice and respectful. Importantly, politics symbolically changed gender stereotypes as well, at least a claim that men and women were equal. And these politics found expression in the DIY look that involved, among other things, slashing and, uh, and cutting shirts, cutting them, streaking them with blood, knotting them, sewing zippers and studs into them, and so on. In a very short time, this look was becoming mainstream in fashion wear, especially in Great Britain, with Vivienne Westwood designing punkwear in the two London shops that she owned with Malcolm McLaughlin. These shops were called, I don't see anything. We're losing. Okay, well, I think we're losing something here. Are we not? This may be. Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It was a brilliant presentation.
I haven't finished actually, but you want to say
Okay,
I'm
ma'am.
finished?
There is some glitch. I'm sorry.
I don't know what's going on. I can't see anything. You can't see you. Oh, here we go. Now I can see you. Do I have time to finish?
I'm sorry, ma'am.
Do I have time to finish?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Please go ahead.
Okay. I lost all sight of you for a while. So this is why I stopped. So as I was saying that this punk wear was being mainstreamed into fashion wear, and the central place for that seemed to be Vivienne Westwood's shops that she owned with Malcolm McLaughlin, who was the manager of the Sex Pistols. The store of Sex that she and Malcolm McLaughlin owned, the clothing from that was used to dress the Sex Pistols, a very famous Sex Pistols, and probably the most famous band in punk. And the shop was known for selling fetish wear, but among its staples were ripped, frayed T-shirts with edgy graphics. And they sold shirts that were slashed and written on by hand, with their seams and labels on the outside showing the construction of the piece. Although Vivienne Westwood is oftentimes called the queen of punk, the genesis of punk is actually in Great Britain's depressed economy, poor education, lack of opportunity, unemployment, and social conflict. And also, it's a reaction by young people against older generations. Now, Westwood was working class, punk inspired, and entrepreneurial, and she drew inspiration from the DIY ethos of the punk subculture. But with a modification of this do it herself clothing, there is no longer a sense of the real cultural, political, and economic confrontation behind what she called punk's, quote, confrontational dressing, end quote. These designs were Westwood's entry into what was called unisex fashion, and showing her recent collections, the androgynous looking models wear torn, cut, and frayed T-shirts with graphics as a sort of accessory to the skirts, which are on display. There was no sense of punk's anti-authoritarianism, anti-corporatism. And the unisex designs, as with unisex designs generally, do not express the struggles faced by LGBTQ plus persons in buying clothing, walking down the streets. They do not, in no place can you see any sense of these designs crediting the LGBTQ plus activists that opened up the gender-free spaces, both symbolic and material, in which high fashion and retail entrepreneurs have claimed and operated. Now, here's the problem that I'm identifying here. And the problem is, I think, fundamentally, it, as I said, does not begin with the difficulty in overcoming very entrenched gender binaries. It comes basically in the form of taming politics altogether, so that overcoming gender ideologies becomes problematic. So when cultural forms of resistance are commodified by entrepreneurs and incorporated into the mainstream, the garment and the wearing of the garment is what I'm arguing, displace the politics that they're supposed to stand for. The production, packaging, and marketing of the commodity can diffuse the subversive power of real action towards dismantling binaries, even while the discourse around commodities recuperates the rhetorics of freedom, democracy, and equality. So unisex fashion can be a part of the process by which resistant elements of the population are to be brought back in line, displacing and taming them. And this relocates the side of politics from queer social movement action to the consumption of a mass-produced commodity.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a brilliant presentation. And now I'd like to request Professor Benilde Reis to present her views on today's topic. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, TMYS, for this invitation to be presenting here to talk with other persons and discuss this theme. Is very curious that around the world there are so many researchers and professors and investigators doing this kind of research considering unisex clothes. Thank you so much, Liza, for your presentation. It's very nice to meet you. Was very good what you just say. You focuses more on society, political, and that side of sociologically speaking. I'm actually my education is from fashion design, so for made more interdisciplinary approach, I'm going to approach maybe some consumer behavior on clothing and pattern making in clothes, because one of the questions that I debated to is, in many of people ask, is like how a piece of clothing can wear in men and women, because they are shaped so different. So in my investigation, I consider that as a investigation question, and my approach to that is that the body types are not so different, ergonomically speaking, are not so different from each other, but are correspondent. There are correspondent silhouettes between men and women that will be fit the clothes. But now I will start to. I know the theme is unisex clothes, and then focusing on genderless fashion or genderless clothes. And there is actually a difference between these terms, and that's also part of my research. So there is difference between several words that are almost used as synonyms, but the spectrum gender is very large. There is some kind of several types of gender, and one of that is genderless, for example. Also, the Liza did mention the LGBTQA plus community. So here, yeah, they enter in this equation of my investigation, but there is a difference between the gender and the sexual orientation, but they complement each other in this investigation. And of course, everything is part of the identity of each person that is also to be considered in unisex clothes. And my point of, I will give you my point of view on the genderless clothing. I actually prefer to talk in genderless clothing because unisex clothes for me, it's about two sex, in the woman and women. And actually there are more, because 1 in 2,000, I think, is born with the two sex or some problem about that gives the parents, who is a boy, is a girl, with the newborn, the new child born, birth. And so because of this, and this is in 2017, I guess 2017, the National Geographic made entirely edition about gender revolution, and there is a documentary that talks about persons that will birth with one type or two types of sex, men and women, and then the parents choose for them, because they are very little, right? And the parents choose for them. And we're growing up doing all that sociological environment that's around us. So pink is for girls, blue is for boys, that type of sociologically environment. But the person doesn't feel right in the sex that parents choose for her or him, and leads them to search kind of questions inside of him or her. And some people actually talk about in that documentary. Is very interesting to see that, because that is also connects with the type of silhouette which person have. So for women, for example, we have at least 6 to 9 types of silhouettes. The most used is the hourglass silhouette. Is that the fashion brands actually do all that clothes, majorly the brands do clothes for the hourglass silhouette, but actually there is a study that says that the hourglass silhouette only covers 20% of women's population. So there is actually other silhouettes, and I begin from here, and the end of my research was do pattern making in clothes and considering silhouettes of men and women, and actually through some details do some clothes like jackets, skirts, dresses, also trousers, but that any type of that clothes can actually wear on women and men at the same time. Okay, there are size charts. I know measurement charts that brands and countries actually use. For example, USA have inches, right? Here is the metric system in Europe, and there is that change, and then there is the change of how they are organized. So USA, for example, have 0 to 4, 6, and so on. And then you have, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. And so on. For example, in Europe, and this is the case that I can talk about because not only my investigation, but also my experience is Portugal. I'm from Portugal, I'm Portuguese, but it's different from England, it's different from France, it's different from Italy, and there are several size of charts for each brand. And it's very complex. It's a theme very complex, but I did approach this problem in my research, so I can have some piece of clothes, considering a jacket, a trouser, or a skirt, both for men and women, but which person can considering himself some other genderless in this case. And it doesn't matter how your body, the shape of your body could be the silhouette of an apple, of a pear, or a triangle inverted. So there are these types of silhouettes in women and men, and we can actually give the consumer this type of clothes, of details in pattern making. So the consumer which actually identifies with this type of genderless, because it started as a fashion trend, right? But I guess we are going so much further than that. and that there actually there are persons, yes, people, sorry, researching for brands that are inclusive for all humankind. Yeah, and that is very, it's very curious to see. And we are reaching a point that is actually specific brands, even smaller brands, considering also sustainability, the ethical part of sustainability, the society inclusive for all the humankind, and smaller brands with slow fashion ethic that includes everyone in that in their mission for the brand. I'm just here to finish my approach. So also there is this difference. I can talk in Europe, I guess in other continents also, but women are using trousers since at least World War II. Actually begin before that with Coco Chanel. And then it's in our day-to-day life, it's normal to see here a woman in trousers, but it's still not normal to see men using skirts or dresses. Any type of of course, then we have the drag queens, then you have the queer approach also, but I'm here speaking about the genderless part, because when we talk about unisex clothes, we see women and women in trousers, but we not see skirts for men, for example. And that's a curious part that I also approach, and I did my research. I actually made a capsule collection that includes dresses and skirts for men. Of course, there is several types of skirts, and I actually be careful about that skirt. I didn't put, for example, mini skirts. I actually put mid skirts or some with some details not equal, for example, to a kilt, because kilt is a Scottish costume. Okay, it doesn't have to be confused with skirt. And besides some details, I did in my capsule collection, did some skirt and dresses for men and women at the same time, considering both of them, considering all the types of gender, but of course focusing on genderless fashion. I guess I can stop from here. Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. English is not my primary language, but I guess you understand me. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. It was very informative. So, with this, we now move on to the question round session. And my first question is for Professor Lisa McLaughlin. So, based on your research on gender and sexuality, I would like to ask you to describe a bit more why you think gender neutral fashion in today's modern world fails to bring equality. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. The reason why I do is that I think that that unisex clothing is oftentimes treated as much more than it actually can be. It's you know, and from the kind of position that I come from, which is based in basically a Marxist political economy, largely, that you can see the T-shirt or the garment or the whatever as being having intrinsic value. Intrinsic value takes into account, in the most simple sense, actually, intrinsic value takes into account basically what the object, the thing is in and of itself. So it's how it's produced, it's the cloth, it's the measurements, and so on, and also with its use value, which is whether or not it actually can satisfy human needs. And in this way, I think unisex clothing performs quite well. Oftentimes, for example, with the extended sizes and so on, in the sort of refusal to name, at least, although it's always there, it seems like implicitly, at least explicitly name, individuals as being gendered in particular ways. But this is what happens in relationships of exchange with such commodities, all commodities, not just unisex clothing, is that they also the amount of worth of them becomes also calculated in terms of what meanings and what kind of generally meanings, interpretations, feelings, and so on that are associated with the clothing. That increases the value because the sense is that if one is wearing, for example, this garment, which is unisex, then one is participating in something like a social movement, when in fact it's not.
Thank you, ma'am. And my second question to you is, as unisex clothes are becoming the new normal in high street fashion, do you think gender neutral clothing is only profitable for capitalist interest and not empowering the non binary youth? Over to you, ma'am.
Yes, if I could just make a comment also about what I was saying before, but related to what Benilde was saying, is that I would just say that in that sense that genderlessness is actually could be seen as an intrinsic value of clothing. That the very fact that someone who cannot find the clothing for themselves and can find that clothing at its size, and for it to be attractive, for example, and not just a T-shirt. So these things are extremely important, and so what and this leads into what the answer to your question was that there's a lot of importance to be attached, I think, to what you call genderless clothing. I don't really like the term unisex myself. And there's so many terms. My God, there's gender neutral, gender inclusive, gender atypical. I mean, it goes on and on. But I think gender fluid is a good category. It's a good name for one. And the reason why I think that it can actually be empowering for persons, including youth, is to have an experience where they're not disappointed in the store, online, and in the street, wearing the clothing. In order to always have to fit into other people's expectations of where one must fit is deeply disempowering. So in that sense, I think it is empowering for individuals to wear genderless clothing proudly, and so on. But at the same time, it's said I don't there are too many articles that are kind of making claims that just are just too much. To say it's that you think that by reading articles and ads and so forth, you would actually think that wearing genderless clothing, wearing a T-shirt, the ultimate sign of genderlessness, wearing your boyfriend's T-shirt or your girlfriend's T-shirt is somehow participating in a political movement.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So now we'll move on to Professor Benilde Reis. And my first question to you, ma'am. As we have seen celebrities like Harry Styles and Zendaya and many to promote genderless fashion, do you think it will cease to be a trend only, or it has a greater relevance in the modern world? Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice words, Liza. Yeah, about that question. Yeah, I don't. And actually, the title of my thesis, I made trends versus paradigm. which made me to research that was actually just a trend or is actually turning into a paradigm. And and no, it's not just a trend, and it's going to we're going to deal with this for as long as our communities and persons wants to be included in some kind of group, because there are several groups now that didn't existed for example in the 90s didn't existed yet, but now the communication is different because we have social media, we have the informations. There are actually too much information, and it's sometimes difficult to filter all that information for what is actually true or the truthness of the information. But besides that, no, and it's not just a trend, and it's much more relevant in the modern world and next generation also. Yeah, and I will continue also to investigate it in this area.
Thank you, ma'am. And my next question to you is, fashion is fascinated with non binary identity precisely because it can't be fitted neatly into boxes and definition. How would you define that, ma'am? Over to you.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, they can be fitted in boxes because we when we talk about the genderless and some other type of genders and unisex, I've actually concurred with Liza about the using not the term unisex, but actually the genderless or gender neutral or gender fluid terms. But I guess it's actually also about authenticity. And actually, the consumer, I'll search for that kind of authenticity to be different from another. But they are always someone not equal to us, but similar to us. So we can form some kind of small group, and in that we have the subcultures. And I guess the subcultures are very important in several communities. So yeah, it's important. Having a box or not, we are all in some segment that we identify or not with other persons' style, politics, society, opinions, etc. And we reach for that kind of persons in our lives, I guess, to have someone that we identify with in this kind of fashion opinions also.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. So, with this, we now come to the end of today's session, and I would once again like to say that we are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems, and for project architecture and submission guidelines. Please visit our website www.tellmeyourstory.biz. I extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Lisa McLaughlin and Professor. Sorry, ma'am. Uh, Good evening, ma'am. Uh, we are at the very end of our session. So, uh,
Have time for
just
Kelly.
so, ma'am, would you like to share your views on today's topic?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I
Please.
think, yeah, of course. Thank you, Shruti. Yeah. So I think that talking about my apologies. Yeah, I think that in many ways that many of these fashion brands, largely a lot of my work like looks at thinking about how gender and sexuality intersect with the fashion system and like production and distribution and consumption. And so a lot of these brands that emerged like in North America who really think about and center gender and sexuality and um, largely they it was like about like after 2010 when this occurred. Um, And so it like largely has like a lot of connections to like legislation around like same-sex marriage. And so like after there was like this proliferation of like attention in like the political realm, many of these fashion brands began, embracing, or these entrepreneurs began embracing like gender and sexuality in like a really overt way and wanting to like center this consumer, which is like in many ways it's complicated because they're of course like capitalizing on this particular community and this consumer, but also in many ways it's important because folks then can like feel an authentic expression of their self through through the consumption of many of these fashion brand products. And so yeah, I think that when we think about like gender and fashion and like the intersection of moving away from this binary perspective, a lot of these fashion brands like St. Harridan and Karen Finch and Rebirth Garments in North America are doing like really amazing work, of course, within the capitalist system. So yeah, that's kind of like some of the work that I do.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. And we have one question for you.
Sure.
Yes, ma'am. So there has been a recurrent outrage over clothing brands reintroducing men's crop top. The issues of adding men to the name to make it more manly. Do you think somehow the intention of unisex fashion is failing to fulfill its purposes?
Yeah, I think that, when we talk about this idea of assigning a gender like to a particular product. So for example, like you mentioned the crop top. So of course revealing one's body, right? Whether it's like the stomach or, it's like the chest area or it's like a lower area on like the buttocks. Like it's like they're like revealing the body. And so in many ways, like this was, viewed as like a feminine um it's viewed as like a feminine way of moving the body like in and out of clothes. And so a lot of times like when it crosses over, for example, when you go from a masculine like a when someone who's assigned male at birth may or who might identify as masculine or masculine of center, and then they adopt a more feminine aesthetic, it's like it's largely like related to the idea of like losing power, and like related to like the patriarchy. And so oftentimes like this will, they'll sort of like masculinize it. Like another really good example is like the Utilikill, which is a brand that is like a North American brand. And so, they're selling an unbifurcated garment and they're really like positioning it as like really masculine. And even like their imagery does this too. Like their advertisements, like um, the copy that they use on their websites also do, use like similar language, right? So they're like reasserting like masculinity like on the product that might be like perceived to be more feminine, right? And so the crop top I think is like a perfect example. Like a men's crop top is like a perfect example of that. And yeah, it's really cool because you see, if you like walk around in like different areas, you'll see like masculine appearing people like wearing crop tops. And so it's kind of cool that it's like it's shifting in many ways. But I think the idea, yeah, of taking I think utility kilts is a perfect example. I think like the crop top, is an example. And even too, like the idea of, feminine colors in masculine styles. But I think there's like an intersection of race there too, because many men of color like often adopt really, really bright colors, especially in like the North American context. So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
of course.
So we are done with our introduction session in the very beginning, but I would once again like to introduce you that Kelly L. Reddy-Best is an associate professor in apparel merchandising at Iowa State University and the curator and director of ISU's Textile and Clothing Museum. In her research, she examines the interrelationships of dress, identity, consumption, regulation, and the fashion system. All of her work is rooted in the social justice lens. She has taught courses across the apparel curriculum in design, product development, merchandising, culture, and history. Thank you so much for joining us, ma'am. So, with this, we now come to the very end of the session. I would once again like to say that we're calling for submissions of stories, essays, poems, and for project architecture and submission guidelines, please visit our profile www.tellmeyourstory.biz. I extend an heartfelt thank you to Professor Lisa McLaughlin, Professor Kelly Elfredi Best, and Professor Benny Reis for this wonderful and remarkable session. Thank you for joining us, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.